Good evening, everyone. Tonight is our public outreach for the budget, which begins July 1, 2021 and ends June 30th, 2022. My name is Lauren Lai, and I'm the Finance Director for the city. I'm really pleased to be here and to kick off this meeting. I want to introduce a few other members who will be joining us tonight to present and or answer questions. We have with us Steve McHarris, the City Manager, Walter Rossman, the Deputy City Manager, Steve Erickson, the Engineer Director, Charmaine Angelo, the Public Information Officer, and Jane Corpus, the Assistant Finance Director. Tonight's meeting is really important because we want to continue to share with you where we are in this budget journey and also solicit your input. For those that can't join us, tonight's meeting will be recorded and posted on our city website. Next slide, please. Before I start to talk about the agenda, I want to take a moment to acknowledge what an incredible job this community has done in weathering this pandemic. It is certainly an unprecedented time, but when we look back, I could see great examples of leadership in the council, in the organization, and throughout the community. We've focused on the health and wellness of this health pandemic, but also the economic pandemic and preserving jobs, focused on our city businesses, our residents, and important in tonight's conversation is preserving city services that are important to you. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the success of Measure F and that the community came behind and came together to vote for a tax measure to preserve services that are important. That $6 million or $6.5 million will be critical and timely in dealing with this pandemic financial crisis. Last but not least, we're having this conversation because the economic struggles of the pandemic continue, and we have about $3 million to solve. And so tonight we will solicit your input and hope that you can give us feedback on what services you would like us to preserve. So in this next hour we have together, this is what we'll talk about, and we hope that you will engage with us and inform us in this process. So important in this process is explaining to you the budget calendar and how the budget development works, talking about budget priorities set by the council, looking at the 10-year forecast. It's important when we do fiscal planning that we not just look at the next 12 months, but take an economic financial look at the city in the next 10 months to inform us today and the next 10 years. And importantly, in good governance and leadership is community engagement through a variety of channels, through tonight's meeting and through other survey tools that we will share with you and hope that you'll take the time to engage with us. Last but not least, we are here to listen to your questions and hopefully answer and clarify anything that will help you help us govern better. Next slide, please. So the budget process. Why is this budget so important? The budget is the document where the council appropriates or gives the city administration a spending plan for the next year. It delineates where we're going to spend the majority of our tax and fee revenues. It's really important that those resources are aligned with city priorities and aligned with community needs. It's a planning document for the next 12 months. And like many other governing process, good governance works when it includes effective participation from the mayor, the council, the community, and staff working together to serve the community. For those that are not familiar with city government, I wasn't myself until I became a city finance director. Government is complex and our finances are complex. We have the general fund, which is where the majority of our operating expenses are. This is where we render a lot of our services that are familiar to you: police, fire, parks, and public works. But as a full service city, we also have a lot of other services, such as our utilities, storm, sewer, and water. And we also maintain our streets. So when we look at our city services, it's important to understand that while we spend a lot of time on the general fund, it's important that we also spend a lot of time in these other funds that provide important city services to you. Next slide, please. Budget calendar. How have we engaged with the council and the community, and how can we continue to engage with you so you can help us adopt this budget by June? Next slide, please. This chronicles our process. It began in January when we surveyed the community through FM3. And in March and April, we're doing these open town hall budget surveys. In January, we proposed a preliminary budget study session where we talked extensively about priorities and where we are financially. On February 11th, we had a study session with the council to look at the preliminary capital improvement program, which I'll explain in a little bit. On March 11th, we had a meeting similar to this one, where we engaged the community and briefed the community on where we stand with our budget. And tonight, we're having that second meeting of the same nature. On April 6th, next week, we will be going to council to study the capital improvement project with the endeavor that the council will approve that budget plan for the next 5 years. On May 4th, we'll be bringing to council the master fee schedule. The master fee schedule is a schedule that prescribes all the fees, such as recreation, such as planning and building permits. And so we'll be bringing that to council for adoption and approval. On May 11th, we will be holding a study session to present and discuss the operating budget. And on June 1st, we will hold a public hearing to adopt the budget. For those of you that are not aware, the city's budget fiscal year begins on July 1 and ends on June 30th. So by June 1st, we hope to have the budget adopted for the upcoming year. Next slide, please. City council priority areas. These are really, really important because they are the pillar of what we do and how we appropriate and how we plan our work. So let's take a little bit of time to dive into these 7 important priority areas. Next slide, please. Community wellness and open space. It's important for us to provide parks and amenities that improve our quality of life. Economic development and job creation. We need to make sure that we have a strong economic base now and into the future that could create strong local businesses and jobs to ensure that we are a sustainable and livable community. The environment is important in the way we live and do business here, that we are a sustainable community. Governance and administration is critical. The backbone of all these public services is good governance. Good governance is prescribed in transparent, public engaging process, but also long-term fiscal discipline and financial stewardship, which is the heart of our discussion tonight. Next slide, please. Neighborhoods and housing. It's important for us as a community to have enough housing stock or units of housing, and that our housing availability is affordable. Public safety, certainly that was confirmed in our public FM3 survey. Police, fire are critical. So we want to be able to provide services where public response for police and fire is going to be acceptable and reliable to our businesses and our residents. Last but not least, transportation and transit. It's important that we work collectively in the region for a multimodal corridor and to work in solving the challenges we have around transportation here within the city and within the greater Santa Clara County. Next slide, please. Services and its funding source. We'll spend a little bit of time to talk high level about what are the city's portfolio of services and where are the sources of revenues that fund these services. So next slide. This shows you here that for the city as a whole, we have $213 million of revenue. This is all funds. And the 3 arrows indicate the top 3 revenue sources for all funds. So let's start with the number 1 revenue source, charges for services. The reason why this is so large in our community is because we own and operate our own utilities. So this would be water and sewer would come in here, but also we have charges for services from building and planning and impact fee as well. Followed by property tax, 17.3%. And third is our sales tax at 11.5%. So this gives you a sense of how our city services are being paid for. Next slide, please. Okay, I just minimized. Great. This slide here shows us our expenditures from a expense category perspective. The three arrows denote the top three expenses. Like all other service organizations, personnel or staffing costs will always be the highest. So in this case here, personnel is 46.8% of the budget. So this includes police officers, firefighter, public works and park maintenance officers, and parks and rec, followed by non-personnel expenditures. You may be curious why it's 26.4%. The city provides utilities such as water. We purchase that water wholesale and we resell it to the residents and businesses here from Santa Clara County Water and also San Francisco PUC. Third highest expenditure, where do we spend our money, is in capital improvements at 18.1%. And we'll have slides to talk about the CIP, but this is basically for building, streets, parks, and other facilities. Next slide, please. I always find this slide particularly very informative because it's a reflection of our priorities for the city. When we look at our staffing, it really denotes where we're spending our dollars and is that in alignment with our public feedback. And you could see here clearly the top three: police, fire, and public works. And so I'm very pleased to see how this allocation is reflected and how that is confirmed by the FM3 feedback as well. And you could see there the other allocations in our other CSAs or community service areas. Next slide, please. This presentation, I think, is very important for us to show you a chronology of the city population versus the city staffing level position, also known as full-time equivalent, but let's just call it positions. So the bar chart denotes two things. One is our staffing level, which is the yellow line, followed by the bars, which is our city population. And as you could see there, our population is rising, while our staffing level has peaks and valleys denoted by three major economic events. The Great Recession in 2009-10, the city certainly reduced staffing significantly due to the economic response, followed by the RDA disillusionment, which was another cut in city revenues. We also had a step down in positions. As you notice, the population for the city is increasing. And during the pandemic, we also did another rebalancing and defunded some more positions. Where we end right now is that the number of positions serving this community is less than we were in 2009, but the population has increased from slightly over 70,000 to over 84,000. So I think that's really important for us to see here. Next slide, please. I'm going to zoom us into the general fund for a moment and have a conversation about the general fund versus all funds, because general fund is where I think a lot of businesses and members of the public focus, because that's where we understand police, parks, fire really comes from. Within the general fund, the top three revenue sources are property tax, sales tax, and fees for service. Importantly, when it comes to sales tax, the city does not get the full amount that members pay. We only get 1.25% of the 9.25% tax rate. Also importantly, with property tax is that the city only gets 16% of the property tax paid. Whereas with fees and services, we do get a more wholesome allocation to the city. There isn't as much sharing of the revenue there. And so, as I mentioned, this is important to understand because the general fund is where we see a lot of our main primary services, such as police, fire, parks and rec, and streets. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll help us understand a little bit more about sales tax. Thank you again for members, for those that voted in favor of Measure F. As you can see here on this pie chart, the Milpitas tax rate is 9.25%. The yellow part of the slides is 1%. The city gets 1% of that, and plus the 0.25 from Measure F. That's the portion of the pie that's been pulled out that represents what the city receives of that 9.25 tax rate. The rest goes to the county and to the state. And that's really important because government finance is very complex. When we pay tax, it's important to know how much came back to us locally. I want to take a moment to explain that local concept. Measure F, 100% of Measure F comes back to the city. And that's the beauty of Measure F. Unlike the other portion, 100% of Measure F comes back to the city. So there's no cost sharing there. So I'm really proud that voters voted for that because there's really a lot of efficiency in that tax. 100% of it comes back to the city. So of this 9.25%, the city gets 1% there and a quarter from Measure F. Next slide, please. Property tax. Property tax is administered by the county. This slide denotes how much comes to the city and how much comes to schools and community colleges and the county itself. We received 6.2%. If I illustrate that, if a property owner pays $1,000 of property tax, the city will receive $162 of that. So it's important to understand how much actually comes to the city and how much is shared with these other agencies that also provide important city services. Next slide, please. So we just walked us through the city services and funding sources within the general fund and other funds. I want to pivot this conversation now to a larger, more economic view and take us through the 10-year forecast. So if I can have next slide. So the 10-year forecast, it's important because over the next 10 years, we'll see some major changes. Namely, Measure F has an 8-year sunset, which means that in 8 years, it will end. And so in the 10-year forecast, we can illustrate what happens to our revenues when that happens. Importantly, TOT, for many of us, we would understand that as hotel tax. The hotel tax in this city, many forecast that it will not fully recover. The hotel industry may take 4 years to recover, and in some communities, it may never really recover fully to the pre-pandemic levels. Our 10-year forecast assumes a permanent reduction. Let's walk you through the revenue projections and the expenditure projections so we understand how the 10-year forecast was developed. It's very important to us when we put together sound financial information that it be data-driven. We look at historical trends, and we also work with consultants who are topic matter experts and departments who are topic matter experts. And in combination with all this, we exercise good judgment in putting together our revenue. On the revenues, on the expenditure side, we have a lot more control over these projections because a lot of those are governed by contracts, especially our labor contracts or various public service contracts. So we have a little bit more control over the revenue on the expenditure projections of the 10-year forecast. Next slide, please. So what does the 10-year forecast tell us? There's a lot of numbers in red. The numbers in red indicates that we are foreseeing a prolonged period of deficit. This was presented a few months ago and the conditions have improved a bit, which I'll walk us through in a little bit. How we read this is that there's 10 years starting with fiscal 20 through fiscal 30-31. Sources is basically the revenue. Uses is basically the expense. Again, this is just the general fund forecast. And as you could see there, we have many periods where we foresee deficits. Next slide, please. How do we show this in a line chart? You could see there that the sources are the use, which is the expenditures, outpace the sources, which is our revenue. The dip in the blue line is when we see Measure F expiring. The gap between the two is basically the deficit. Next slide, please. So the 10-year forecast has certain estimates and assumptions in there. It's important for us to disclose to you what it does not assume. So what are potential costs that are not assumed in that 10-year forecast would include funding for our aging infrastructure. We have a lot of assets that are important to providing city services. They're in need of repair. We are not certain of the service impact around the development of the Milpitas Transit Center. What services will there need to be around public safety, public works, labor contracts, and certainly critical is we are not certain about the changes in the local, state, and national economy, which certainly affects us and will influence the 10-year forecast. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the 10-year forecast previously illustrated has improved since we first published this to the council and the community. One thing about this pandemic that we have all done is continue to monitor, assess, adapt, and report. So we've been going to the council every few months to do that, monitor, assess, adapt, and adjust. So in January, we had a deficit of almost $7.5 million. Council directed us to come back at mid-year to correct this, and we corrected it in the mid-year rebalancing process with reductions of almost 14 positions. We used prior year savings as well to carry over and address some of the next year's challenges. And in doing so, we now have a shortfall of $3 million, as I had mentioned in the opening slides. So we are now at a $3 million deficit, which is our call to you to help us understand how to fix this. Next slide, please. So over the next 5 years, what this shows is that we have 2 years of deficit, a slight improvement in 2023, and remaining deficit. So we certainly need to fix it structurally to get us out of this and in a more sustainable, financially stable position. Next slide, please. How did we address this? As I mentioned in the opening, I'm really impressed with the collective leadership because what this illustrates here is a very comprehensive, complex, and hybrid approach to solving the problem. You'll see there that we've addressed ongoing strategically $19 million from 4 major strategies: personnel reductions, non-personnel reductions, major new revenues, and no wage increases when 3 of our bargaining groups and our unrepresented employees stepped up, opened labor contracts, and waived wage increases. That's really impressive. It speaks loudly to the council, the community, and this organization. So now we have $3 million going into this budget exercise. Next slide, please. So I think it's important for us to explain how we approach balancing our budget. As I mentioned to you, governing and governance is really important. So our budget balancing process, we are informed. We listen to the community in many ways, through the council, community employment engagement, through many channels, social media, tonight's meeting, public meetings, council meetings. So there are many channels for these engagements. We have set budget council priorities, as I mentioned, those 7 priorities. In addition, during this pandemic, the council has also prescribed a fiscal response strategy and guidelines. In the budget document, you'll also find that we have fiscal policies and guidelines. One key policy that I want to point out was that this community has been very financially astute in creating and establishing sound reserve policies. We also funded those policies. Many communities have these policies, but they don't fund them. Being diligent and disciplined that way has enabled this community to respond very well to the pandemic. We had reserves to be able to stabilize our services, so we should be very proud about that. The budget guidelines in the booklet for the budget, and also available online, gives us a framework to develop the budget, gives us a calendar and some guidelines within there in terms of how we shape the budget year over year. Last but not least, it's important that we're always incorporating best practices in balancing our budget, looking for innovative revenue opportunities and expenditure and service opportunities. Next slide, please. So how does all of that translate into possible actions in this pandemic? These 5 points here kind of translate those approaches into actionable things. Number one, have a hybrid strategic mix of short-term and long-term strategies when it pertains to staffing. That's important because the way the pandemic affects our city services differ depending on the services we're talking about. We needed to reduce and defer services based on fluctuation in demands and priorities. Also importantly is that we needed to focus on full cost recovery from our development services and maximize our use of technology and make government more efficient and effective in what we do. Last but not least, we are able to provide city services through revenue. So in addition to Measure F, we're looking at fees and other opportunities to ensure that we have a stable, robust revenue base to provide city services to the community. Next slide, please. So we just talked about the operating budget, which is really important. I'm going to pivot the conversation now to capital improvement program, which really focuses on the city's assets and infrastructure. So if we can have the next slide, please. Capital improvement program, also known as the CIP. What is it and why is it important? So let me explain to you kind of why it's important. As a city, we have a lot of city assets, many of which you might know, like city streets and parks and building. But as a full service city, we also own our own utilities, such as our sewer system, storm system, and our water system. It's very, very important for us that we stay on top of the maintenance and repairs of these services to ensure that we are able to financially pay for them and that they can provide services to the community for a long time. So the CIP document is a 5-year infrastructure planning document. It basically delineates the repair needs for these assets and delineates the funding sources and the revenues, funding sources and the spending for these different projects. So I'll go through these 3 budget bullet points. One, it's a planning document that ensures that we can upgrade and repair and replace our aging infrastructure. It ensures that we're able to render these services in accordance with the council's priorities in planning, managing, and appropriating our funds. And last but most critical is that it ensures that we're able to provide to this community a safe and livable community. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide is going to walk us through the 5-year plan. And so I want to take a moment to summarize the categories, talk to you a little bit about the high level and also the different funding sources for CIP. As you can see there in that table, we have about 6, it appears to be 6 project categories. So let me just explain to you really quickly. Community improvement is community parks, other facilities, and a little bit of a catch-all category. We have parks, which is self-explanatory, streets, and our 3 utility facilities, water, sewer, and storm. This is a 5-year CIP estimated cost summary. Over the next 5 years, we plan 132 projects totaling $210 million. In the budget process, while we plan for 5 years, we only budget and appropriate the first year. The next 2 to 5 years don't actually have budget adoption yet. Important to note here is that of that $210 million, $70 million does not have funding. That's really important. So you may ask, what are the different funding sources for CIP? Since we talked about it on the operating expense and the general fund side. When it comes to paying for our capital improvements, we have utility rates, which is like your water bill, your sewer bill. We have general fund. We have impact fee from developers. As projects are developed in our community, there's impact to community. And so we take revenues to offset those impacts. We have gas tax for the streets. We also actively apply for grants. We have state and regional allocations, and importantly also is the success of the recent local tax measure as well. So that gives you a sense of all the funding sources that can contribute into the CIP projects. Of this $210 million and $132 million, next year in fiscal 22, we have planned 33 projects or about $22 million. Of that, the general fund will fund about $3 million, and the rest will come from all these other sources that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. This slide here shows a summary of the $70 million of projects that do not have funding. We have an aging infrastructure that certainly needs attention and repair. It is important for us to find funding sources because, as many of us know, deferred maintenance means that the cost of the repair will escalate over time. This shows the 70 million in those major categories: community improvement, parks, streets, water, sewer, and storm. What's not notated here is, in addition to the $70 million of unfunded need in the next 5 years, we also have $170 million beyond these 5 years. Again, $170 million beyond these 5 years. And examples of that would be replacing the fire station, improving parks, streets, and our utility facilities. So this is a very important point to highlight. How can you engage, and how have we engaged you? CIP is very important. In February, we brought to the council and had a public meeting about the proposed CIP plan. We also brought these projects to 2 commissions, the Planning Commission and the Parks and Rec and Cultural Services Commission. Next week on April 6th, we will be bringing the CIP to the council for review and approval. All of this is available on the city website, and we hope that you'll be able to engage and give us feedback and provide us support. Again, we have an aging infrastructure that needs funding and investment, and we hope you'll tune in on April 6th. Next slide, please. So now I'll turn it over to the Deputy City Manager, Walter Rossman, for community engagement.
Good evening. Thank you, Lauren. Walter Rossman, Deputy City Manager. So I just want to talk a little bit about community engagement. Lauren already mentioned how important it is for the council to engage you for this meeting tonight, as well as for service which we have done in the past, and which is ongoing right now. So we'll talk about the resident service, which Charmaine is going to summarize for us, and then the town hall meeting survey, which we have currently in place. You can respond to it on the website. You'll receive information on that. And lastly, there's a meeting about the capital budget on April 6th. And as Lauren talked about in the calendar, we have public hearings for the adoption of the budget scheduled for June 1st. Now I'm going to turn it over to Charmaine.
Thank you, Walter. Next slide. Good evening, everyone. My name is Charmaine Angelo, and I'm the Public Information Officer with the city. So as Walter mentioned, we will be utilizing various communication tools to have ongoing engagement with residents and other stakeholders. So I want to talk to you about the community survey. Next slide. As some of you have heard, the city seek the services of FM3 for our annual community survey. This is the 3rd year in a row that we have worked with them in gathering public opinion and feedback from Milpitas residents. We interviewed about 795 adult residents from the city, and our research ran early this year between January 5 to the 20th. Our recruitment method was through telephone calls, email invites, and postcards, while we gathered information through telephone interviews and online surveys. We're happy to share that the research was conducted in multiple languages, namely English, Spanish, Chinese, and Vietnamese. On February 16, FM3 provided a deep dive presentation to City Council, but tonight I'm happy to share highlights of the survey results. Next slide, please. So we always get excited when we share this information because it really is heartwarming to learn that Milpitas residents are overwhelmingly in agreement about the city's strong sense of diversity and inclusion. 79% are content with their quality of life. 87% agree that diversity is an asset. 83% feel that diversity is embraced and celebrated. 82% agree that Milpitas is a wonderful place to raise a family, while 80% associate living in the city with a sense of pride. But I want to highlight the last bullet point. It's quite notable because 77% recommend Milpitas to others as a place to live. So let's pause for a moment and think about that. Our residents are happy and are endorsing and promoting our city to others for pretty much for free. But we should be very, very proud about this. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to share top-line information that showcases the high approval ratings for our city's public safety priority areas, with fire and police at 89% and 81% respectively. Additionally, it's worth noting that majority of residents approve of the city's response to coronavirus pandemic. We take great pride in being the first city in Santa Clara County to issue a mask order, and are also very proud to be the only city in the county to create an innovative mobile testing unit utilizing a fire department ambulance as a testing base. And lastly, we have an 80% average in satisfaction ratings in the categories of police protection, 911 response, traffic enforcement, and park maintenance. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share some key takeaways. Public opinion about life in Milpitas continues to be very positive and mirrors what we have seen in 2020. I've mentioned earlier that residents are very proud of the city and consider it a great place to raise a family. However, there is mixed opinion and perceptions about the city being an exciting and affordable one. Also interesting to note is that a small percentage of residents disapprove of the city's services and policies on affordable housing and homelessness. Also worth mentioning is that public opinion about the city's fast growth has steadily declined in the past 3 years. And lastly, public safety and public works remain as top priority areas. And Lauren had alluded to that many times in her presentation. Next slide, please. So part of our community engagement is an open town hall survey, which we launched on March 5. We've asked participants questions associated with the prioritization of the council priority areas. So due to potential service cuts, we really want to know what matters most to you. Next slide. So we'd like to invite you to take our survey on the city website. It's our city website /budget survey, as you can see on the screen. And the survey will be available until the end of April 30th. And you can choose to keep your responses anonymous. And we would like to invite you to tell us what our budget priority should be. This concludes our presentation. And now I'm gonna turn it over to our Deputy City Manager and Moderator, Walter.
Thank you, Charmaine. So thank you, Lauren, again, great presentation. So now we're gonna turn it over to you who are attending this event tonight. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, which is at the bottom of your screen. We'll monitor those hand raises and we'll take your questions as soon as they're available, as soon as you raise your hand. I see some attendees already here. So but we're all here to respond to you. City Manager McCarris is here, as well as Lauren talking about finance. So don't be shy and please let us know if you would like to know anything else from us. I see Alice McDonald raising her hand. Do you want to speak, please?
Thank you, Deputy City Manager Rossman. Glad to be here tonight. I noticed in the Public Information Officer, Charmaine Angela's presentation, she mentioned that there was, in the survey responses, some disapproval of the city's handling of housing and homelessness issues. I was wondering if she could say more about what the feedback was, and I was wondering if you, Mr. Rossman or Mr. McCarris, could give us an idea of how the city might be able to address that in the budget.
I can start. Thank you for your question, Ms. McDonald. Unfortunately, I don't have the raw data in front of me right now, and I could certainly circle back with you in giving you like exact percentages on what that statistic illustrated. But overall, based on the questions that were raised in the survey, I think the feedback that was given to the specific question with regard to services, this was the category that had the lowest rating. That much I can share with you, but the actual number I don't have with me right now. But I can do a follow-up, certainly.
Thank you, Charmaine. I'd like to add too, when you look at that FM3 survey, they covered a variety of topics across the city. So as you can imagine, with all the topics and all the issues that involve city life, city services, city amenities, what people are looking for, residents are looking for, that issue was in that whole mix. And so I think relative to all those, Charmaine is just describing where this lies on people's minds as far as issues or concerns. Is that right, Charmaine? Does that kind of characterize it pretty well? Yeah. So I think with the details, she can provide some more detail to you on that. As far as programs, I'll let Walter speak a little more specifically to it, but just a higher level is that the budget does include a whole division within a department on housing. So I think some of that response is that we have 3 full-time positions related to housing, homelessness, all of those issues, which is pretty robust for a city of our size and population. Maybe Walter, you might have something else, of course, with a director overseeing that as well. So three full-time positions in that area. There's a number of programs, of course, through CDBG, other funding sources, housing authority sources, funding as well in the budget. And that's maybe where I'll pass it on to Walter to give us a little more detail.
Yeah, I think you covered it quite well, Steve. Thank you. The other thing which I just want to add, as you know, Allison, the council adopted or approved the pilot program for showers and for washing stations for the homeless population or the unhoused population. And so once we conclude this pilot, we'll find out other policies the council may want to adopt. Further, the assessment we're doing with the county contract assessment of the unhoused population. Once this assessment is completed, we'll see where the council stands on providing additional services to the unhoused population.
If I may say, I'm somewhat concerned about the shower service, that we were under the impression it was going to be weekly for 6 months, and it apparently is not. It's only happening a couple of times a month, so it'll be difficult to gather the data that is necessary, and for people, unhoused people, to understand that which days it's happening, and to be able to show up when it's actually there, and not showing up when it's not there. So that's a concern that I have right now.
Okay, so we noted the concern. Just to clarify that the dates, the outreach that we do to the homeless population has the dates that we have, and I think the concern is that there's not a pattern of alternating Tuesdays or certain days that might be more memorable, rather than just the list of dates that those services are being provided. Likely part of that is also the availability. The service is also provided across the county, so we're likely using it within the scope of what's available to us, and probably I'm going to also say probably that I know we didn't fund it for likely as I'm going to say as many days as might be ideal for the number of people we are serving.
Thank you for your responses.
Sure, thank you, Ms. McDonald. Any other raised hands, any other questions we could respond to? We'll be happy to do that. Mrs. Navarro? There we go.
Thank you for the great presentation, Ms. Lay, and welcome to Milpitas. I know you're pretty new here. I wanted to let Charmaine Angelo know that I did do the survey, and my recommendation is to define the 7 categories. It's not clear when you take the survey what community wellness and open space means. I mean, it just makes that statement, but there's no definition of it like you just did today. You have a slide that shows those 7 and you define them. Well, the survey doesn't define them. So when you're trying to give your ranking and rating, it's whatever you think environment means, whatever you think transportation and transit means. So it would be best to update the survey so there's a definition of each one of those 7 categories, so that when you're doing your prioritization, it would be clearer to the people that you want to get information from. That's my recommendation for the survey. Second item, I would like if you could explain how sales tax is brought back to the city for online sales. I know during the pandemic, there's a lot of online sales, and the sales tax associated with that is done differently than going to a store, okay? And I'm hoping that by explaining it, maybe we could take an approach to try and get some of our representatives to redefine how it's done so that we can reap more money from that. There should be a way for the city to get back something more than what they're getting back now for online sales. That's my second one. My third one is a definition of what community improvement is and what are the projects. And I did listen to the presentation prior to this one. What are the projects that are included in community improvement that aren't getting done and which ones are getting done? There was no real list. That's it. That's all I have. Thank you very much for having this meeting.
So thank you for the feedback on the survey. We'll definitely look into this, and then we'll turn it over to Lauren.
I'm sorry, did you want to turn it over to me for the sales tax question?
Yes,
Yes.
please.
Oh, sure. Hi, Barbara. Nice to meet you. So the sales tax online question is a little tricky, so I'm going to break it down. There's 2 taxes. One is the state tax rate, that 1% in that pie chart. The way online sales tax is allocated to the city relative to that has to do with a pool. We're a part of the pool, and we get a weighted average of that pool allocation. So you're right. I think politicians should change the way online distribution comes to the city, because odds are the city is not getting its full allocation because of this pool method for online sales. The second tranche of our revenue is Measure F. Measure F is governed by a different revenue code within the state. Because of that, the online sales allocation is based on really place of use, where it was delivered. So if a Milpitas person bought something from Amazon, that sales tax, that 0.25%, comes directly to the city without any revenue sharing. So that's why I think Measure F as a local measure is so effective for this community. 100% comes back to the city without sharing. Whereas online sales, with the state rate, that 1% portion, the city gets a weighted average, and we do lose a lot because of this pooled weighted average method. I'm happy to hear that a member of the public is very interested in this topic.
There was a third question. I believe it actually was the CIP question. If Steve,
Right.
would you like to take that?
Would it be possible to share the screen?
Sure. Of course, that was for what projects are not being done.
Right. I could, if I could share the screen, I could project what's in
Yes,
the
you
current
can.
capital improvement program.
Yes, you
Let
can.
me try that. Okay, can everybody see that? Can you see what's on the screen right now? It should be the part of the capital improvement program.
Yes, we can, Steve.
Okay, so for the community improvement projects, this is the section in blue here. These are projects that are not funded, starting with fiscal year 22-23. The funded year is the first year, so we don't have projects. The projects in the first year are always funded, as Lauren had mentioned. So I'll just run through these really quick. Fire station improvements, those are basically public works maintenance projects at all 4 fire stations. Could be anything from carpet replacement to repainting to air conditioning improvements, pavement work. Next project, city building improvements. Again, that's a public works maintenance project for the upkeep and renovation of city buildings. The third project down is city building roof repairs. That's kind of self-explanatory. Technology projects. These are projects that would be managed by our IT department for upgrade of technology within the city, computer systems, just about everything that's technology that allows city staff to provide services to the community. Next project, annual tree replacement program, self-explanatory. On-call facility maintenance and repair services. So these are contractors that would provide miscellaneous services to the city. Could be custodial services, for instance. Project or page 102, capital improvement program administration. So this is a new project this year. It's funded in fiscal year 21-22, but the out years we don't currently have it funded. This project provides for the completion of the annual capital improvement program. So it covers everything from staff time of the engineering and finance departments to actually printing of the document. Next project, city parking lot rehab. So this is to repair and replace damaged pavement within city parking lots. So it's City Hall, Public Works Department, park facilities, etc. Project on the list is the Metro Community Facilities Building. This was added a few years ago. This project would provide a new community center building facility within the transit area specific plan area down near the Milpitas transit station. So that covers the projects that are not currently funded for community improvements. We've got a list for park improvements shown here. It's basically, I'll run over these really quick, but citywide park maintenance, on-call services for parks and landscaping. So this is a contractor that would work for Public Works. Sandalwood Park renovation. So the design for that project is complete, but we do not have the funding for construction for this project. Minor sports court resurfacing, or it's just rehab. So it basically include resurfacing and restriping. So this would be for the city basketball courts, tennis courts, and Metro Sub-District Park. So this was a new park that's proposed down within the TASP area. We also have a list of projects within the streets, sewer, and storm that also are not funded. So I won't take the time unless someone's asked, but again, there's a number of projects that we have shown that we do not have the funding to complete. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Steve. I think before we answer any more questions, I just really wanted to jump in and correct myself and give the correct information on the mobile showers question. So staff did let me know that the showers are scheduled for every Sunday, and it runs from 11 to 3 and it's actually being modified to 11 to 3:30 based on the operations we've performed so far. So every Sunday. So anybody that's thinking it's less often or only a couple times a month, that's incorrect. And just want to make sure everybody knows that we are providing a better service than what might be rumored out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We got a comment from Ms. McDonald. What portion of the budget is going towards police? Is there a way to put more of that funding into community wellness programs that support non-police crisis responses? So the public safety budget is about 48%. That includes police and fire for the entire general fund. So most of the, about 50, so that's the largest portion of what is to departments in comparison to the rest of the general fund. And I do believe we partner with nonprofits, but I'm not that close to this unless Steve knows more than I do regarding crisis response. But obviously it's a council decision to support more non-police crisis response if they deem so as appropriate. You know by any chance, Steve?
I don't know that I could get into more specifics on that. I think we'd have to dive into more details of what the meaning of that is. In fact, what specific responses we're referring to.
Okay. Sounds good. Then in the meantime, I think we have a raising hand from Ms. Navarro. So I'll take your turn next.
I wanted to thank you for the response, great responses, and just put in my 2 cents worth. Sandalwood Park is really, really important in this area. My home is close to it, along with some of the other parks. It really needs to be done, and I would hope that there might be a way, find a way to get that back in the budget.
Thank you. Steve, it's a different question for you. And the question is, I would that Ms. McDonald would like to see the undergrounding of utilities take priority in the CIP because of fire danger. So do you want to speak to how the undergrounding happens and how it's funded?
Sure. So undergrounding, the city receives Rural 20A funds from the Pacific Gas and Electric Company that we can use toward the undergrounding of utilities within certain areas of the city. So we completed one section on South Milpitas near Montague Expressway. That was undergrounded approximately 2 years ago, just before the completion of BART. The next project that we're looking at is on South Main Street from approximate limits are, I believe, Carlo to Montague Expressway. It'll be done in phases. PG&E is doing that design right now. The issue is that we do not have the funding to complete the construction. Part of the work for undergrounding requires city to purchase right of way within private property.
It's big time, big time, big time.
Right. So even though the utilities within the street would be underground, there's still services to those different properties, and it requires easements across those properties for not only electrical service, but above ground transformers. PG&E has placed that responsibility back on the city to acquire that right away. So that's a big ticket cost. There's also other improvements that are required for underground service of electric that would be on the city to purchase or provide. And that would be, for instance, the conversion of an overhead electrical facility to underground that requires work at the property's circuit breaker outside their box. So again, that's not on PG&E to provide, that's on the city. So at this point, even though the design is underway using PG&E Rule 20A credits that we have, construction is at this point unfunded. The Main Street project I mentioned, the estimated cost is about $6 million.
Thank you, Steve. Ms. Navarro, I'm not sure your hand is still raised for another topic, or did we answer your questions? Okay, I think we did. Thank you very much. Anybody else who has a question for us? Feel free to use the Q&A or raise your hand.
It'll just know we're approaching the 7 o'clock hour.
Okay, well, then I do want to thank everybody who attended. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us. We have a budget website with an email address, and we'll be happy to respond to you. And then please attend, if your time permits, our capital improvement program, adoption of the CIP for the next 5 years, next week, Tuesday. And then we have a budget study session on May 11th regarding the operating budget. Again, thank you for being here tonight, and wishing you a good evening. Bye-bye.